I'm here in Rio de Janeiro in the Catete Palace. This palace was the home of the President of Brazil for 66 years, from 1894 to 1960. And it's a place that symbolizes the enormous political power that Rio de Janeiro exercised over Brazil for perhaps 150 years. We can trace this originally back to the 1820s, when the constitutionalist crisis in Portugal brought Dom João VI back to Lisbon. The constitutionalists were firm on the idea of controlling both crown and provinces, and they certainly wanted to control Dom Pedro I, the prince who was left in charge of Brazil. So the constitutionalists and their allies in the Portuguese military here in Rio were determined to crack down on the independence of the colony, creating a natural synergy between those Brazilians who wanted a little bit more autonomy and the crown prince, who wasn't particularly happy at the idea of his prerogatives being curtailed. When the Portuguese military tried to dominate, he called up on the people of Rio de Janeiro, and they came to his aid. Along with the Royal Palace Guard, he was able to control 10,000 people, perhaps, to face down merely 2,000 Portuguese soldiers. And so Brazil got its independence. It also transformed itself because of liberalizing ideas that were very much in the air in Rio de Janeiro. And so this didn't become some petty autocracy, but a constitutionalist empire, one in which both Pedro I and then his long-lived son, Pedro II, operated under clear rules. This palace itself was built during the empire's time, but built not for political purposes, but for a sugar baron, the Baron of Novo Friburgo, who owned thousands of slaves. In fact, the empire itself got into trouble when the daughter of Pedro II, Princess Isabel, decided to free those slaves. Dom Pedro himself had long favored emancipation, but he never had the temerity to do it. When he was away in Europe in 1888 seeking medical help for his diabetes, his daughter took the plunge, declaring the thousands of slaves in Brazil free. Princess Isabel did have the guts to abolish slavery, and she has been almost universally admired for it ever since. But, and this is important, the slave-owning elites of Brazil were not so enthusiastic about it. Once they lost slavery, they didn't see why they were supporting the emperor. And so a military coup, backed by those elites, deposed him in Rio in 1889. The original leaders of the post-coup republic were military men, but eventually in 1894, power passed to a civilian who decided it was worthwhile to get a little bit of physical distance from the military power. And so he moved the seat of the presidency right here, in what was essentially a suburb during the day, and gave himself a little bit of relief from that much proximity to military power. Nonetheless, revolts in Rio continued to shape the path of Brazilian politics. In 1910, the sailors' revolt of the lash occurred in the harbor, where sailors who'd been trained in Newcastle, England, and had been exposed to the better conditions and more ready pay given to English sailors, rose up. They seized control of some of the most powerful ships in the Brazilian Navy and demanded reform. Their revolt ended in failure, but it did in fact achieve at least a little bit of reform for the Brazilian Navy. Then again in 1922, the tenentes, the lieutenants, revolted in the fort of Copacabana. Once again the revolt was put down, but the ideas of liberalizing revolution were in the air. The ideas of the tenentes revolt did not disappear, and in a sense they were then carried on by Getulio Vargas, who once again achieved power through a revolution and coup, and he came here to be the most durable resident of this palace between 1930 and 1945, and again then after 1950 for another 4 years. Vargas controlled the destiny of Brazil from these walls. The Vargas era came to an end in 1954 when an attempt to assassinate his opponent Lacerda failed right here in Rio de Janeiro. A major was killed instead, but Vargas responded by shooting himself in his pajamas in this very building. The end of the era of Rio de Janeiro as Brazil's capital came 6 years later. In 1960, when President Kubitschek walked down these stairs, leaving the presidential palace for the last time, and ended his day in Brasilia, the new capital far from Rio. And so Rio's age as an imperial city was over. But of course, like all imperial cities, it has left us a legacy in stone, which we see around us, a reminder of the decades when Rio exercised power over the entire country.